So do you ever feel like you're a slave to your urges? Like whenever you get an urge to binge eat, you actually just prepare for the urge. You actually start ordering from the takeaway, or you grab all the food from the cupboards, or you grab them from the fridge and the freezer, and then just take them all to your room. You just hoard them all into your room, and you just think, okay, I'm gonna have a binge eating episode now, because even just a tiny bit of an urge, that's it. There's no point in just trying to fight back, because I've tried to fight back so many times, and it just ends up in a binge eating episode. So in this video, I'm gonna be talking about 3 evidence-based techniques to break these binge eating urges. What you should do when you get the urge before a binge, and what you should do after you had a binge eating episode to prevent a binge later on. So the first thing you can do when you get the urge to binge eat is to take part in cold water immersion. So cold water immersion is essentially what it says. Splash yourself with cold water, like maybe in the sink or in the kitchen, essentially, because when you're splashing yourself with cold water, that actually triggers the mammalian dive reflex. So this is our instinctive habit where when we're splashed with cold water, it's as if we're like jumping into the sea, and it's actually a survival response to slow down our heart rate. And when we're slowing down our heart rate, then our anxiety decreases, our urges almost disappear or decrease. It's like a reset. You're resetting your body, and it's a survival response that we're actually just tricking our body that we're actually trying to slow down our heart rate when we're feeling anxious, because oftentimes before a binge you get this little surge of anxiety, like, oh, here we go again, it's time for a binge. But if you splash yourself with cold water or have a cold shower, then you're just restarting your body, and that's giving you a chance to break the urge really quickly. So the second technique is another skill you can use before a binge eating episode when you have the urge. It's called urge surfing. So if you've been following my videos for a while, you'd probably hear me talk about this very often, because urge surfing is a really powerful skill. So urge surfing, first of all, goes by the idea that when we have the urge to binge eat, or urge to, it's also used for like smoking and alcohol. When we have any urge like binge eating, then sometimes we feel like we're a slave to our urges, like, oh, might as well prepare for the binge. Well, that's actually not true. No matter how many times you had a binge eating episode, if you've been struggling with binge eating for days, months, or even years, you're not a slave to your urges. So urge surfing goes by the idea they peak and then disappear in 30 minutes, or they try to fade away, shall I say, is a better word. So what you should do within this 30 minutes is keep yourself distracted or take part in a self-care activity. Have you ever taken part in an activity where, like you've been gaming or you've been painting, and then the time just seems to fly by, and then you're like, oh, it's been 2 hours already. Well, you don't have to do 2 hours, but like for 30 minutes, keep yourself distracted in a self-care activity. So it could be like having a shower, a nice relaxing shower, having a nice bath, meditating. You could be taking part in a coloring book, maybe going for a nice relaxing walk without the intention of trying to burn anything off. And maybe some people might even find gaming quite helpful because it keeps you distracted. But ideally something like non-competitive, because if you're taking part in most of the time competitive gaming, then that can be quite stressful. And if you do lose, then that can make you more vulnerable to a binge, because you want to kind of give you some sense of like achievement or like dopamine rush. I wouldn't suggest cooking because, well, when you have the urge to binge eat, do you ever look at a cake and then you start to like salivate, like, oh, this looks so delicious? Well, we're trying to take part in non-food related activities and non-stressful activities in urge surfing. And if you're taking part in urge surfing for the first time in your life, or first time in a long time, then there's a good chance you might still have a binge eating episode. And that's completely alright, because the trick with urge surfing is that you're trying to increase the gap between urge and action. So sometimes we could be here where when you have the urge, we just automatically jump straight to actioning that urge, which is having a binge eating episode. But the more you take part in urge surfing, like one day you try to implement it, okay, there's a tiny bit of gap. It's getting a bit easier to break through the urges and binges, the automatic response. And then hopefully the more you implement urge surfing every time you get the urge to binge eat, then the gap would be so big that you have lots of thinking room to break out of that urge. Or you probably already have the coping strategies, such as like having a shower every time you feel quite anxious, or having a bubble bath, or taking part in like coloring, or just having a nice walk. So it works hand in hand, these coping mechanisms and increasing the urge and action, the gap between that. So urge surfing is a really, really powerful skill. So if you feel like you're having to implement urge surfing right now and watch a nice YouTube video, if you find this nice, then keep watching. But if you want to take part in other self-care activities, then go for it. And the third and final technique, which is mainly used after binges, is opposite action. So opposite action is a DBT, dialectical behavioral therapy skill. It's around the same area as CBT. So it's more of an acceptance and mindfulness technique. So opposite action. What is opposite action? Opposite action goes by the idea that, let's say after you had a binge, you feel anxious, you feel embarrassed, you feel guilty, you feel even angry at yourself. Those are the thoughts. And then the actions you want to do is, I want to skip breakfast. I'm gonna have a really low-calorie lunch. I'm gonna jump on this extremely restrictive diet so I can make up for this binge. So the binge restrict cycle in a nutshell is you have a binge eating episode, and then you feel guilty guilty, and then you have low self-esteem, and then you try to make up for that binge, so you jump onto an extremely restrictive diet, and then that triggers a binge eating episode. So you're in the cycle of binge restrict, binge restrict, binge restrict. So how about we change something in the cycle? So rather than jumping onto a restrictive diet, we try to eat regular meals. So let's have breakfast. Because sometimes having breakfast after a binge might be enough to just break the binge restrict cycle. Maybe after a binge eating episode, we do the opposite of what we normally feel. So rather than feeling guilty, feeling shameful, embarrassed, feeling angry at ourselves, we give ourselves self-care. We have a nice bubble bath. Maybe we have a nice walk outside if it's safe. Maybe we just take part in watching a nice relaxing show on TV and then put on a face mask or whatever you find relaxing. So what you're essentially doing with opposite action is actually you're changing the outcome of the future by changing how you're feeling and how you're planning on acting on right now. So it's actually breaking the cycle of the binge restrict cycle. So opposite action is a very powerful DBT skill that you can try to implement tonight. Even if you have a binge eating episode, try to implement opposite action. So Binge Free Living is essentially my weekly newsletter where I give free distress tolerance tips, techniques, binge eating habits, and what's new in the binge eating news. And I also share personal things that broke my binge eating habits. And I've been binge free for 5 years now, and it might seem like a really long time, but I'm still sharing these tips because if I didn't implement these kinds of tips that I've talked about in this video and I didn't share it with other people, then they wouldn't have had to reach their goals or live lives that they're not constantly thinking about food 24/7. It really changes other people's lives, and I want to share that in the weekly binge eating newsletter. And comment below, do you have any self-care tips that you implement after or before binges? And I'll see you in the next video. Bye!